Lila woke with a start, her breath hitching as the remnants of a dream clung to her like a ghostly veil. Her bedroom was dark, the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains casting soft shadows on the walls. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid thrum of her heartbeat beneath her fingertips. The dream had been so vivid, so real, it left her trembling. In it, she had been standing in a vast field of golden grass, a man's voice calling her name in a way that sent shivers through her soul. She didn't recognize him. And yet, she did. At her feet, the soft rustle of movement drew her attention. 7 pairs of eyes glimmered in the moonlight, watching her intently. Her dogs had always been her solace, her protectors, but tonight, their presence felt different. Each of them Atlas, the steadfast Mastiff Willow, the curious golden retriever Shadow, the silent black shepherd Luna, the excitable terrier Ember, the wise Australian shepherd Storm, the playful husky Nova. The gentle greyhound seemed unusually still, as though they too had been touched by something unseen. "It was just a dream," Lila murmured, her voice shaky. But the words felt hollow even to her. Dreams didn't leave her feeling like this, like her very soul had been pulled from her body and cast adrift in a place she couldn't name. She slid out of bed, her bare feet brushing against the cool floor as she moved toward the window. Outside, the world was serene. The forest that surrounded her cabin bathed in silver light. It should have comforted her, but instead she felt the nagging pull of something missing, something she couldn't quite place. That's when she saw him. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, half shrouded by the shadows of the trees. Lila froze, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the figure. The moonlight outlined his tall frame, his broad shoulders, and the sharp lines of his face. He didn't move, but she felt the weight of his gaze even from the distance between them. It was piercing, almost magnetic, and it sent a jolt through her chest. Her dogs rose to their feet, their sudden movement breaking the spell. They didn't bark or growl, but they gathered around her, forming a protective semicircle as they stared at the man in unison. It was as if they recognized him, though Lila knew she had never seen him before. Or had she? Summoning her courage, she stepped onto the porch, the cool night air brushing against her skin. "Who are you?" she called, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. The man hesitated, his head tilting slightly, as though debating whether to step closer. Finally, he moved into the clearing, his steps slow and deliberate. The light revealed more of him, his dark, unruly hair, the chiseled angles of his face, the storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "My name is Evan," he said, his voice low and resonant. "And I think we've met before." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't know this man, she was sure of it. And yet, as she looked into his eyes, a flood of memories that weren't hers surged through her mind. She saw flashes of herself in different times, different places, standing on a windswept shore, her hand entwined with his, sitting beneath a sprawling oak tree, as he whispered words of love, holding him as the world burned around them. She stumbled back, her dogs pressing against her legs to steady her. "This is insane," she said, shaking her head. "I don't know you." "You do," Evan said, his voice soft but insistent. "Not here. Not in this life. But before." Lila wanted to argue, to dismiss him as some kind of delusion, but the intensity of his gaze made it impossible. He believed what he was saying, and some part of her, a part she didn't fully understand, believed it too. "You're crazy," she said, her voice trembling. "You have to be." Evan took a step closer, his expression earnest. "I know how this sounds. But you felt it too, haven't you? The dreams. The memories. The feeling that something is missing." Her breath hitched. She had felt it. For as long as she could remember, there had been a hollow ache in her chest, a sense of searching for something she couldn't name. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of her otherwise content life. And now, standing here with this stranger, it felt as though the missing piece was finally within reach. "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "Why me? Why now?" Evan hesitated, his gaze flicking to her dogs. "Because the cycle is repeating. And if we don't stop it, we'll lose each other again." The weight of his words pressed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. She didn't know what he meant by cycle, but she could feel the truth in his voice. This wasn't the first time they had stood here, staring at each other across the chasm of lifetimes. Her dogs began to move, circling Evan in a slow, deliberate pattern. They didn't seem threatened by him, but their actions felt purposeful, as though they were testing him. Evan remained still, his gaze dropping to each of them in turn. When Nova, the greyhound, pressed her nose against his hand, a faint smile touched his lips. "They remember," he said, looking back at Lila. "Just like we do." The tears that had been building in her eyes finally spilled over, hot and relentless. She sank to her knees, her hands gripping the edge of the porch as the weight of it all crashed down on her. Evan didn't move, didn't try to comfort her, but his presence was steady, an anchor in the storm. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "We can. Together." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Together. It was a promise, a plea, and a challenge all at once. Lila looked up at him, her heart pounding. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain: her life was no longer her own. It was tied to his, bound by something far greater than either of them could comprehend. Her dogs returned to her side, their warm bodies pressing against her as though offering their silent support. Lila took a deep breath, her hand resting on Saul's head as she steadied herself. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't face it alone. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'll listen, but you'd better start explaining." Evan smiled, a faint, bittersweet curve of his lips. "It's a long story," he said, stepping closer. "But it starts with us, and it ends with breaking the cycle." As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, Layla felt a spark of something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time: hope. It was fragile, tenuous, but it was enough. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time she felt ready to face it, together. The morning after Lila and Evan's fateful encounter, the world felt different. The sun filtered through the canopy of trees surrounding her cabin, casting dappled light on the soft earth, but its warmth seemed almost alive. The air itself buzzed with an energy Lila couldn't quite name. Her 7 dogs lingered near her, more attentive than usual. Even their playful moments seemed measured, as if they were waiting for something, watching. "Oi." Evan leaned against the wooden railing of the porch, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line. His presence was as steady as it had been the night before, though now there was a quiet intensity about him, as if he were gathering his thoughts. Lila sat on the steps, her hands resting on her knees, her thoughts a tangled web of questions and emotions. The bond between her and Evan, undeniable yet impossible to fully comprehend, was both a comfort and a source of unease. "Your dogs," Evan said suddenly, breaking the silence. "They're not just dogs." Lila blinked, her head snapping up to look at him. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cautious. "They're part of this," he said, turning to face her. His storm gray eyes met hers, and the weight of his gaze made her breath catch. "Of us. Of everything." Lila frowned, her hand instinctively reaching out to scratch behind Saul's ears. The golden retriever pressed against her, his warmth a balm against the unease creeping into her chest. "They're my family," she said firmly. "They've always been with me." Evan stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He crouched down in front of her, his voice soft but unyielding. "And they always have been. In every life, every cycle, they're tied to you, to me, to this endless loop we're trying to break." His words sent a shiver through her, though she wasn't sure why. She looked at her dog Sol, Onyx, Titan, Misty, Ember, Storm, and Nova. Each one met her gaze in turn, their eyes filled with a depth she had always known but never questioned. They were more than companions. They always had been. "Explain," she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "What are you saying?" Evan exhaled, his shoulders relaxing as if he had expected her resistance. "In every life we've lived, they've been with us. They're souls, Lila. Souls bound to us, guiding us, protecting us. Each of them carries a piece of the strength we've needed to endure, to find each other again and again." Lila shook her head, her pulse quickening. "That's impossible. They're just..." "Look at them," he interrupted gently. "Really look." She hesitated, her heart pounding as she turned her gaze to Saul, the ever-loyal golden retriever who had been with her the longest. His eyes met hers, warm and steady, and for a moment she felt a wave of emotion that wasn't her own. It was calm, reassuring, and filled with a love so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Next was Onyx, the silent shepherd who rarely left her side. His dark eyes held a quiet wisdom, a patience that seemed far older than his years. Titan, the towering mastiff, exuded strength and protection, his massive frame a constant reminder of his vigilance. Misty, the smallest of the group, leaned against her leg, her playful demeanor hiding an intelligence that felt almost human. Ember, the Australian shepherd, tilted her head, her gaze sharp and curious, as though she understood more than she let on. Storm, the husky, wagged his tail, his playful energy masking a courage that had seen them through countless challenges. And Nova, the greyhound, sat quietly at the edge of the group, her gentle presence a source of quiet healing. "They're US," Evan said softly, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "They're pieces of us, of what we need to face the challenges ahead. Without them, we'd never have made it this far." Lila swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. She wanted to deny it, to cling to the simplicity of her dogs being just dogs, but the truth was undeniable. They had always been more. She had always known it, deep down. What do they represent, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evan's gaze softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing against Saul's head. Loyalty, he said. That's Saul. He's the anchor, the one who keeps you grounded. He turned to Onyx, his expression thoughtful. Wisdom. The quiet kind, the kind that waits and watches before it acts. Strength, he said, his voice firm as he looked at Titan. Not just physical, but the kind that endures. Misty is courage, he continued, a faint smile touching his lips. The kind that doesn't know its own limits. And Ember, Lila asked, her voice trembling. Curiosity, Evan said. The spark that keeps us moving forward, even when it's easier to stand still. Lila's gaze shifted to Storm, the husky with boundless energy. Playfulness, Evan said, his tone lighter. The reminder that even in darkness, there's light. Finally, his eyes rested on Nova, the quiet greyhound who rarely left Lila's side. And healing, he said softly. The kind of love that mends what's broken. Tears streamed down Lila's face as she looked at her dogs, her heart aching with a mix of wonder and sorrow. She had always loved them fiercely, but now she understood why. They weren't just her companions, they were her soulmates, her guardians, her family in the truest sense. What do we do with this, she asked, her voice breaking. How do we move forward? Evan reached for her hand, his touch steady and reassuring. We trust them, he said simply. They've always guided us. They'll guide us now. As the words settled over her, the air around them seemed to shift. The light filtering through the trees grew brighter, warmer, as though the forest itself were responding to the bond they had acknowledged. Her dogs moved closer, their bodies pressing against hers in a silent show of unity. Lila looked at Evan, her tears glistening in the golden light. I don't know if I'm ready for this. He smiled, his gaze steady. You don't have to be. We'll figure it out. Together. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the weight of uncertainty lingered, but it was tempered by the strength of their bond. Lila felt it in every breath, every heartbeat. She wasn't alone, not with Evan, and not with the 7 souls who had always been by her side. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by a love that transcended lifetimes. The fire crackled softly in the center of the clearing, its amber glow casting long, flickering shadows against the ancient trees surrounding them. Lila sat on a patch of moss, her knees drawn to her chest, while Evan paced just beyond the circle of light, his hands clasped behind his back. The air between them was thick with tension, the weight of their shared revelations pressing down on both of them like a storm about to break. Lila's dogs were spread around her in their usual positions, but tonight they seemed unusually still, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Saul, her ever-loyal golden retriever, rested his head on her knee, his eyes watchful. Misty lay curled by her feet, her small frame vibrating with quiet energy. Onyx and Titan flanked her like twin sentinels, while Ember, Storm, and Nova lingered near Evan, their movements deliberate, almost as if they were trying to soothe his restless energy. Evan, Lila said softly, her voice breaking the heavy silence. I need to know. If this is real, if we're truly tied to these past lives, then I need to understand what happened, why we keep losing each other. Evan stopped pacing, his gaze snapping to hers. For a moment he looked as though he might argue, but then his shoulders sagged, and he nodded. He crossed the clearing to sit across from her, the firelight casting golden highlights across his sharp features. His storm-gray eyes were filled with a mix of pain and determination. You deserve the truth, he said finally. But it's not easy to hear, or to relive. Lila's heart clenched at the vulnerability in his voice, but she forced herself to nod. I need to know, she said, her voice firmer now. We can't move forward if we don't face it. Evan hesitated for a moment longer before closing his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was low and steady, as though he were reciting a story etched into his very soul. The first time we lost each other was in a kingdom of stone and ice, he began. You were a queen, and I was your protector. It wasn't supposed to happen what we felt for each other. You had a duty to your people, and I had a duty to you. But it didn't matter. Every time you looked at me, it felt like the world stopped. As he spoke, Lila felt a strange pull in her chest, like a thread being drawn tight. The world around her seemed to blur, and suddenly she wasn't sitting in the forest anymore. She was standing in a grand hall, its stone walls adorned with tapestries depicting scenes of victory and sorrow. She was dressed in layers of heavy fabric, the weight of a crown pressing against her temples. Evan was there, younger but no less intense, his armor glinting in the dim torchlight. I told myself I could resist you, he continued, his voice filled with quiet anguish. That my duty was more important than what I felt. But then the war came, and everything changed. The vision shifted. Lila was standing on a battlefield now, the air thick with the scent of blood and ash. Evan was at her side, his sword drawn, his face fierce with determination. They were surrounded, their enemies closing in. She felt the panic rising in her chest, the desperate need to protect him, even as he shielded her with his own body. I died for you that day, Evan said, his voice cracking. And I would do it again, 1,000 times over. The vision dissolved, leaving Lila gasping for air, her chest heaving as though she had truly been there. She looked at Evan, tears streaming down her face. You died because of me. I died for you, he corrected gently. There's a difference. Before she could respond, another wave of memory swept over her, pulling her under. This time she was in a bustling market square, the air filled with the scent of spices and the hum of voices. She was a healer, her hands stained with the residue of herbs and poultices. Evan was there too, his face smudged with dirt, his clothes tattered but his eyes alight with mischief. You saved me, Evan said, his voice cutting through the memory. I was a thief, nothing more. But you saw something in me I didn't see in myself. You gave me a reason to be better. The memory shifted again. They were in a small room now, its walls lined with jars and bundles of dried plants. Lila was laughing, her hands on her hips as Evan teased her about something she couldn't quite hear. He stepped closer, his expression softening, and she felt the heat of his body as he leaned in to kiss her. The joy in that moment was so pure, so complete, it made her heart ache. But then the door burst open, and the world came crashing down. I was arrested, Evan said, his voice heavy with regret. They called me a criminal, and no matter how hard you tried to save me, it wasn't enough. I was executed for crimes I didn't commit, and you never forgave yourself. The memory shattered, leaving Lila clutching her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her dogs pressed close to her, their warmth grounding her as she struggled to process the onslaught of emotions. I can't do this, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's too much. You can, Evan said, his voice filled with quiet strength. We have to. The final vision came without warning, dragging her into its depths before she could prepare herself. She was in a grand library, its shelves stretching endlessly in all directions. Evan was there, his fingers brushing against hers as they stood before a table covered in maps and documents. They were scholars, seekers of knowledge, but their quest had led them into dangerous territory. We were searching for the truth, Evan said, his voice distant. For answers about the cycles we didn't even know we were trapped in. But the knowledge came at a cost. The memory darkened. They were surrounded by shadows now, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in. Evan was shouting, his voice filled with desperation as he tried to hold the darkness at bay. Lila felt her own fear rising, but it was eclipsed by her determination to protect him. I lost you that night, Evan said, his voice breaking. The darkness took you, and I couldn't save you. The memory faded, leaving Lila shaking, her tears falling freely. She looked at Evan, her heart breaking at the pain etched into his features. This is why we keep losing each other, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Because we keep sacrificing ourselves for each other. Evan nodded, his gaze filled with both sorrow and hope. But now we know. We can change it, Lila. We can break the cycle. She reached for him, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his. How? By trusting in each other, he said simply. By choosing love over fear. Every time. Lila's dogs gathered around them, their presence a steady reminder of the bond that had carried them through lifetimes of pain and loss. As she looked at Evan, she felt a spark of something she hadn't dared to feel before: hope. It was fragile, but it was enough. Together, they could rewrite their story. This time, they wouldn't fail. The forest dissolved around them, melting into a blinding white void that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. Lila's breath hitched as the familiar grounding presence of her cabin, the trees, and even the warm, solid forms of her dogs faded away. Only Evan remained, his hand gripping hers tightly, his storm gray eyes locked on hers as if anchoring them both in the face of the unknown. I'm here, he said, his voice steady but tinged with tension. We'll face this together. What is this place? Lila asked, her voice trembling. The air around them felt heavy, charged with an energy that pressed against her chest and made it hard to breathe. The trial, Evan said grimly. The one we've failed in every life before this. Before Lila could respond, the void began to shift. Shadows bled into the white expanse, swirling and coalescing until they formed a landscape that was eerily familiar. It was her childhood home, but distorted, stretched, and warped like a memory gone wrong. The house loomed before them, its windows dark and empty, its once welcoming front porch sagging under an invisible weight. Her dogs appeared suddenly, their forms solid and real once more. They surrounded her protectively, their eyes sharp and alert. Sol pressed against her side, his golden coat a comforting presence, while Titan and Onyx flanked Evan, their growls low and menacing as they stared at the house. "We're supposed to go in there?" Lila asked, dread curling in her stomach. Evan nodded, his jaw tight. "The trial doesn't happen in one place. It happens here." He touched his chest, just above his heart. "In us. It's going to show us what we fear most, Lila. What's held us back, life after life." Her heart pounded as she looked at him, her hand tightening around his. "What if we fail again?" "We won't," he said, his voice resolute. "Not this time." With her dogs at her heels, Lila stepped toward the house, Evan at her side. The moment her foot touched the warped wooden porch, the world shifted again. The front door creaked open of its own accord, revealing a long, dark corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. The air inside was cold and heavy, carrying a faint metallic scent that made her stomach churn. As they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Lila spun around, panic surging, but the door was gone. Only an unbroken wall of shadow remained. "It's starting," Evan said, his voice low. "Stay close." The corridor twisted and stretched as they walked, the shadows flickering with shapes and images that sent shivers down Lila's spine. She caught glimpses of her past, a moment of heartbreak when she was a teenager, the silent grief of losing her parents, the time she had doubted her worth. Each memory felt like a stab to the chest, but she forced herself to keep moving. Evan wasn't immune to the corridor's tricks. His jaw was clenched, his eyes darting to the images that flickered in the shadows. She saw reflections of him too, moments of failure, of loss, of unbearable guilt. His grip on her hand tightened with every step, and she squeezed back, a silent reminder that they were in this together. They reached the end of the corridor and stepped into a vast, empty room. The walls were mirrors, each reflecting distorted images of themselves. But as Lila looked closer, she realized the reflections weren't just of her and Evan, they were of their past lives. In one mirror, she was dressed in regal finery, a crown on her head and tears streaming down her face. In another, she was a healer, her hands bloodied as she cradled a dying Evan. Each reflection carried the weight of their failures, their losses, their pain. "This is what it wants us to see," Evan said, his voice tight. "To remind us of every time we've fallen short. Every time we've let fear and doubt tear us apart." Lila swallowed hard, her throat tight. "How do we fight it?" Before Evan could answer, the mirrors began to ripple, and figures stepped out of them, distorted versions of themselves from the past. The queen, the healer, the scholar, and others she didn't fully recognize, but each carried an aura of despair and anger. The queen stepped forward first, her eyes filled with bitterness. "You think you can break the cycle?" she hissed. "You're doomed to fail, just like we did." The healer followed, her voice trembling with anguish. "You'll lose him again, Lila, just like you always do. And this time it will be your fault." The words cut deep, but before Lila could respond, Sol let out a sharp bark, stepping between her and the figures. His golden coat seemed to shimmer in the dim light, and for a moment the shadows recoiled. "They're not real," Evan said, his voice firm. "They're manifestations of our fear. That's all." But they felt real. The pain in their voices, the weight of their accusations, it was almost too much to bear. Lila looked at Evan, her chest tightening. "What if they're right? What if we can't do this?" "They're not right," Evan said, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Look at me, Lila. Whatever this thing throws at us, it doesn't change what's real. I'm here, you're here, and we have each other." His words steadied her, and for the first time she felt a spark of defiance rise in her chest. She turned to the figures, her voice shaking but strong. "You don't control us anymore," she said. "You're just echoes. You're not us." The figures faltered, their forms flickering like a dying flame. Her dogs pressed forward, their growls growing louder, their presence a shield of love and loyalty that pushed the shadows back. Sol's bark rang out like a bell, shattering the silence, and one by one, the figures dissolved. The mirrors shattered, and the room dissolved into light. Lila and Evan stood in a field of golden grass, the air warm and alive. The trial was over, but the weight of what they had faced lingered. "You did it," Evan said, his voice filled with quiet awe. "We did it," Lila corrected, turning to him. She stepped closer, her heart pounding as she reached for his hand. "And we'll keep doing it. Together." He smiled, his storm gray eyes softening as he cupped her face in his hands. "I'll never let fear take you from me again," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "You won't have to," she whispered, leaning into him. As their lips met, the golden light around them seemed to grow brighter, enveloping them in warmth. For the first time in countless lifetimes, they had faced their fears and emerged stronger. Together, they were unstoppable. The golden field dissolved, leaving Lila and Evan standing in a space that defied comprehension. The air shimmered with iridescent light, shifting between colors that had no name, and the ground beneath them felt solid yet formless, like the surface of a still lake. Above, stars spun in dizzying patterns, their movement too precise to be random. It was beautiful, overwhelming, and terrifying all at once. At the center of this endless expanse stood a single pedestal. Upon it rested two glowing orbs, their light pulsing with an almost heartbeat like rhythm. One orb was a deep, calming blue, radiating warmth and tranquility. The other burned with fiery intensity, its light a mix of crimson and gold, as if it contained the essence of the sun itself. Both seemed to hum with energy, a call that resonated deep within Lila's chest. Her dogs surrounded her, their gazes fixed on the pedestal. Sol stood closest, his golden coat gleaming in the strange light, his tail wagging faintly as though urging her forward. Titan and Onyx flanked her as always, their dark eyes steady and protective. Misty whimpered softly, while Ember and Storm pressed close to Evan, their forms tense. Nova sat quietly at the edge of the group, her gentle presence a beacon of calm amidst the chaos. Evan stepped forward first, his jaw tight as he stared at the orbs. "This is it," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "The choice." Lila's breath caught, her eyes darting between the two glowing orbs. "What choice?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Evan turned to face her, his storm-gray eyes heavy with emotion. "One orb represents freedom and end to the cycle. If we choose it, we'll break free from this endless loop of loss and pain. But..." His hesitation was like a knife to her chest. But what she pressed. "But it comes at a cost," he said, his voice trembling. "If we choose it, we sever our connection to everything, our past lives, our memories, even our bond with them." He gestured to her dogs, his expression pained. "They've been with us in every life, guiding us, protecting us. Choosing this means losing them." Lila's stomach twisted, her knees threatening to buckle. She looked down at her dogs, her heart breaking at the thought of a life without them. They had been her constant, her foundation. The idea of letting them go was unbearable. "And the other orb?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evan's gaze shifted to the fiery orb. "The other lets us keep everything, our memories, our bond with the dogs, all of it. But it doesn't break the cycle. We'll keep living and dying, finding each other and losing each other again and again. It's the choice to keep fighting." Lila felt the weight of his words settle over her like a crushing tide. She turned to her dogs, her eyes filling with tears. Sol looked up at her, his golden eyes calm and steady, as though he understood everything without needing an explanation. Misty nuzzled her hand, her small body trembling. Titan and Onyx stood tall, their silent strength a reminder of the protection they had always offered. Ember, Storm, and Nova watched her with quiet intensity, their presence both grounding and overwhelming. "How can I choose between them?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "They're my family." Evan stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers. "You don't have to choose alone," he said. "We make this choice together. Whatever happens, I'm with you." Lila turned to him, her chest tightening at the raw vulnerability in his eyes. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do you think we should do?" Evan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Every part of me wants to hold on," he admitted. "To keep fighting, to stay with them, with you. But I also know what the cycle has done to us. How many times we've suffered because we couldn't let go." His words tore at her, but she knew he was right. Every life they had lived had been defined by love and loss, by moments of joy that were always followed by heartbreak. The cycle had bound them together, but it had also broken them time and time again. "What if we don't come back to each other?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What if letting go means losing us forever?" Evan reached out, cupping her face in his hands. His touch was warm, steady, grounding her in the moment. "If we're meant to be, we'll find each other again," he said. "In this life, the next, or whatever comes after. But we can't keep living in fear. Not of losing each other, not of losing them." Tears streamed down Lila's face as she looked into his eyes, her heart breaking and mending all at once. She turned to her dogs, her voice shaking. "What do you think? What should I do?" They didn't speak, of course, but their actions spoke volumes. Sol pressed against her leg, his warmth a silent reassurance. Misty licked her hand, her small body vibrating with quiet courage. Titan and Onyx stood close, their unshakable presence a reminder of the strength she carried within herself. Ember and Storm wagged their tails faintly, their playful energy a spark of hope in the heavy moment. And Nova, ever the healer, rested her head on her knee, her soft eyes filled with love and acceptance. They trust you, Evan said softly. Whatever choice you make, they'll be with you, even if it's not in the way we're used to. Lila took a deep, shuddering breath, her heart breaking and mending all at once. She reached out, her hand hovering over the two orbs. The blue one pulsed gently, its warmth a promise of peace. The fiery one burned brightly, its light a testament to the strength of holding on. She turned to Evan, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. We choose freedom, she said. For them. For us. Evan nodded, his expression a mix of sorrow and relief. Together they reached for the blue orb, their hands brushing against its surface. The moment their fingers touched it, a wave of warmth and light washed over them, dissolving the space around them into golden radiance. Lila felt her dogs pressing against her one last time, their presence a bittersweet ache in her chest. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Thank you for everything." And then they were gone. When the light faded, Lila and Evan stood in a quiet, sunlit meadow. The air was still, the world peaceful in a way it had never been before. She looked at Evan, her heart heavy but full. "We did it," she said softly. "We broke the cycle." Evan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "And we're still here," he murmured. "Together." As they stood in the meadow, the sun warm on their faces, Lila felt a deep sense of peace. The choice had been the hardest she had ever made, but it had been the right one. They were free. And no matter what the future held, she knew they would face it together. The meadow stretched endlessly in every direction, bathed in a soft, golden light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers, and the ground beneath Lila's feet felt alive, humming faintly with an energy she couldn't name. She stood at the edge of a crystal-clear lake, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the golden sky above. It was a place untouched by time, by pain, by the endless cycle they had just broken, and yet it felt like the beginning of something entirely new. Evan stood beside her, his hand intertwined with hers. His storm-gray eyes, so often filled with tension and sorrow, now held something else, peace, tempered by a quiet awe. He looked at her, his gaze soft but burning with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "The difference." Lila nodded, her throat tight. She did feel it. The weight that had hung over her for as long as she could remember, the echo of lives lived and lost, was gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, waiting for the inevitable. She was here, now, fully present. "It's like the air is lighter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like the world isn't pressing down on me anymore." Evan smiled faintly, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand. "That's what freedom feels like." The word sent a shiver through her, both thrilling and terrifying. Freedom. It was what they had fought for, what they had sacrificed so much to achieve. But now that it was here, it felt almost too vast, too overwhelming to grasp. Her gaze dropped to the lake, the perfect reflection of the sky rippling slightly as a soft breeze stirred the surface. "Do you think they're still with us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The dogs." Evan's grip on her hand tightened, his other hand coming up to cup her cheek. He turned her gently to face him, his expression unwavering. "They're always with us," he said. "Not in the way we're used to, but in every breath, every step we take. They're part of us, Lila. They always have been." Her chest ached, the loss still raw despite the peace that surrounded them. But his words rang true, and as she closed her eyes, she could almost feel them, their warmth, their loyalty, their love woven into the very fabric of her being. When she opened her eyes again, Evan was watching her, his gaze filled with something she hadn't seen in lifetimes: hope. It was quiet but fierce, like the first spark of a fire in the dead of night. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. He smiled, a slow, genuine curve of his lips that sent warmth flooding through her chest. "Now we build something new. Something that's ours." The promise in his words made her heart race. She stepped closer, her free hand resting against his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her palm. It was a sound she had heard in so many lives, in so many moments of love and loss. But now it felt different. It wasn't a heartbeat marked by the countdown of their time together. It was endless, unbroken. As if reading her thoughts, Evan leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers. "No more endings," he said softly. "Just this. Just us." Her breath caught, and for a moment the world around them disappeared. There was only him, his warmth, his strength, the way his presence steadied her even as it set her heart ablaze. She tilted her face up, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was as soft as it was electric. The kiss deepened, And Lila felt herself melting into him, her hands sliding up to rest on his shoulders as his arms wrapped around her. It wasn't the desperate, all-consuming kind of kiss they had shared in past lives, fueled by the knowledge that their time was fleeting. This was different. It was steady, patient, like the first brush of sunlight after a storm. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths mingling in the warm air, Lila felt a smile tug at her lips. "You kiss like we have all the time in the world," she teased, her voice trembling with emotion. Evan chuckled, the sound low and rich. "We do," he said simply. "For the first time, we actually do." The words struck her, their truth settling deep in her chest. For so long, their love had been defined by its fleeting nature, by the inevitability of loss. Now there was no ticking clock, no shadow looming over them. Their love wasn't bound by time anymore, it was free, endless, and entirely theirs. As they stood together, the golden light around them seemed to intensify, the world itself responding to their union. The lake rippled gently, as though applauding their victory, and the soft hum of the air grew louder, wrapping around them like a melody. Evan took her hand again, his fingers lacing with hers as he turned toward the horizon. "Come with me," he said, his voice filled with quiet excitement. "There's so much to see." Lila followed without hesitation, her heart soaring as they began to walk. The meadow stretched out before them, shifting subtly with every step, as if the world itself was being written anew beneath their feet. Wildflowers bloomed in vibrant bursts of color, their petals catching the golden light, and the sky above seemed to shift and swirl, painting a tapestry of stars and clouds. As they walked, Lila felt the weight of the past lives they had left behind slipping further and further away. The pain, the loss, the endless cycle of separation, it was all a distant echo now, a shadow that no longer had power over them. What remained was love, pure and untethered, unshackled by time or fear. She glanced at Evan, her heart swelling as she took in the quiet joy on his face. "Do you think we'll ever get used to this?" she asked, her voice light. He turned to her, his smile widening. "I hope not," he said. "I hope it always feels like this new, overwhelming alive." Her laughter joined his, the sound echoing through the meadow as they continued their journey. And as they walked, hand in hand, Lila felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. This was what they had fought for, not just freedom from the cycle, but the chance to create something entirely their own. In that moment, she realized that love wasn't just a thread that tied them to the past. It was a force that propelled them forward, giving them the strength to face whatever lay ahead. It wasn't bound by time, by place, or even by the lives they had lived. It was eternal, unyielding, and theirs to shape. As the horizon stretched out before them, infinite and filled with possibilities, Lila knew one thing for certain: their story was just beginning. And this time there would be no end.